I booked a quiet cabin to get away, but I don't think I was ever alone. What I found inside wasn't meant to be seen. One of the things I've always valued about my job is that it gives me the chance to step away from everything for a while, leaving the noise of the city and its daily pressure behind me. It creates a distance that makes everything feel quieter and easier to handle, even if it's only temporary. It allows me to reset my thoughts in a way that I can't do when I'm surrounded by constant distractions. A few months ago, after a very exhausting period of work, I decided that what I needed was a complete break, a place where I could be alone without any distractions. I felt like my mind was overloaded and needed silence more than anything else to recover properly. I wanted a place where nothing could interrupt me or pull me back into the stress I was trying to escape. I opened Airbnb and started browsing the listings, looking for something isolated, something far away from everything, like it existed outside the normal world. I kept scrolling until I found places that felt distant enough to completely disconnect from everything familiar. I was searching for something that didn't feel real, something that existed far beyond the usual routines of life. I chose this cabin hidden in a mountainous area, completely surrounded by trees, a place where time seemed to slow down without you noticing. It looked like the kind of place where days could pass quietly without anything ever changing around you. It gave the impression that once you arrived, the outside world would simply stop existing. All the reviews were positive in a typical way, describing the place as peaceful and perfect for anyone looking to escape, which was exactly what I needed. Every comment repeated the same idea that it was calm, comfortable, and exactly what people were searching for. It sounded like the ideal place to disconnect completely and finally relax without any interruptions. I booked it for the weekend without thinking too much, assuming it would be a quiet trip where nothing would happen except rest. I didn't feel the need to overthink it, since everything about it seemed simple and exactly what I was looking for. I was convinced it would just be a normal, peaceful escape with no surprises waiting for me there. The trip started normally, but the farther I got from the main roads, the more I noticed how everything around me changed quickly, especially the density of the trees. The surroundings slowly shifted into something that felt less familiar and more isolated with every mile I passed. The trees became thicker and closer together in a way that made the road feel narrower than it actually was. My phone signal completely disappeared, leaving me without maps or any connection to the outside world, which made the road feel longer than it actually was. I realized I was fully cut off from everything, with no way to check directions or reach anyone if needed. That disconnection made every minute of the drive feel stretched out and more unsettling than before. When I finally arrived, it was already dark, not the darkness of the city, but a deep darkness that made anything beyond a few feet impossible to see. It felt heavier than normal darkness, like it was swallowing everything around me the moment I stepped out. There was no light pollution, no distant glow, just complete darkness surrounding the cabin from every direction. I stepped out of the car and looked at the cabin. The place was quieter than it should have been, as if it was holding its breath. There were no sounds of wildlife or wind, nothing that usually fills that kind of silence in nature. It felt unnatural, like the environment itself was frozen in place, waiting for something to happen. I grabbed my bag and went inside, and the first thing that caught my attention was how everything looked unnaturally clean. It didn't feel like a place that had been used recently, even though it was clearly maintained. There was something off about how perfect everything seemed the moment I stepped in. It was like every object had been placed intentionally and never touched after that, from the neatly arranged chairs to the small details that felt more than just coincidence. Nothing looked out of place, but that level of order made it feel less natural and more deliberate. Even the smallest items seemed positioned with a purpose that I couldn't fully understand. The first night passed quietly. I sat on the back porch, listening to the sound of the wind and trying to enjoy the silence. I tried to focus on the calm atmosphere and convince myself that this was exactly what I needed. Everything seemed peaceful on the surface, even if something about it felt slightly off. But something about that silence wasn't completely empty. There was a feeling of anticipation more than peace. It didn't feel like a natural quiet, but more like something was waiting beneath it. The stillness carried a tension that made it difficult to fully relax. The next morning, I woke up early, and for a moment, everything felt normal again, that expected calm of nature. The daylight made things seem less intense, almost like the night had been exaggerating everything. For a brief moment, I felt like I had overreacted to nothing. I made myself some coffee and stood on the porch looking at the endless stretch of forest, convincing myself that this was why I came. The view was exactly what I had imagined when I first booked the place online. I kept telling myself that this was supposed to feel relaxing and worth the trip. But that feeling didn't last long. I started to feel again that I wasn't alone, even without any reason. The sense returned slowly but stronger, settling in without any clear explanation. There was no sound or movement, yet the feeling was impossible to ignore. I turned instinctively, and of course there was nothing there except the empty cabin, and yet that wasn't enough to reassure me. My mind expected to see something, even though logic told me there was nothing there. The emptiness itself started to feel unsettling instead of comforting. I decided to go for a run on one of the nearby trails, thinking that movement might help clear my mind from this anxiety. I thought focusing on something physical might distract me from the thoughts building in my head. It felt like the best way to break out of the uncomfortable tension I was feeling. At first it worked, but the farther I went, that feeling came back stronger. The distraction didn't last as long as I had hoped once I moved deeper, however, into the trail. The deeper I went, the more intense that same presence seemed to become. It felt like something was following me out of sight, close enough for me to feel it, and far enough for me not to see it. The sensation stayed just at the edge of my awareness, never fully revealing itself. No matter how many times I looked around, there was never anything there. At some point, I stopped completely and stood in silence, trying to listen to anything that might explain what I was feeling. I focused on every small sound, hoping to catch something that made sense. The silence felt heavier the longer I stood there without hearing anything clear. For a single second, I thought I heard something behind me, the sound of a step, or maybe just the movement of leaves. It was quick and unclear, just enough to make my heart race suddenly. I couldn't tell if it was real or something my mind created in that moment. But when I turned, there was nothing, just the same endless trees, which made it worse. The lack of anything visible made the situation feel even more confusing. It was harder to accept than actually seeing something there. When I returned to the cabin, I told myself again that it was just anxiety, and that being alone here might affect your perception. I tried to rationalize everything as a normal reaction to isolation. It seemed like the only logical explanation at that point. For a while, I managed to convince myself that everything was fine, until I started noticing things inside the cabin I hadn't paid attention to before. The more time I spent inside, the more small details began to stand out. Things that felt insignificant at first slowly became harder to ignore. It started with something small, like a dark object fixed in the corner of the living room, which I first thought was a smoke detector. At first glance, it didn't seem unusual or worth questioning. It blended in just enough to avoid drawing immediate attention. But the more I looked at it, it became clear that it wasn't placed randomly, especially because of the angle it was directed toward the center of the room. The position felt too precise to be accidental in any way. It seemed intentionally aimed at something specific inside the space. As soon as I noticed that, I started seeing more, one near the kitchen and another by the bedroom door. Once I became aware of it, I couldn't stop noticing similar objects around me. They were placed in different spots, but shared the same purpose. All of them were small, all of them facing inward, and that's when I realized that everything happening in that cabin wasn't just in my head. Every single one of them was positioned in a way that suggested something was being watched. That realization made it impossible to ignore what I had been feeling the entire time. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just staying in that cabin, I was being watched inside it. And if those cameras were recording, then someone out there already knows I found them. Part 2 is on Hidden Steps TV, and it gets much worse.